The ultimate trick of the extraction grid wasn't taking your money. It was convincing you that you still own the biological hardware you walk around in. We are operating in the era of the phantom architect, a coordinate in the systemic drift where the concept of private property has been surgically removed from the human genome. You do not own your heart rate. You lease it from the stress vectors of the market. You do not own your attention. It is a mortgaged asset traded by the hour. In the visceral baseline of history, the predator possessed absolute title to its own meat. If it hunted, it kept the caloric yield. If it slept, the recovery was a private metabolic event. The 2026 grid has inverted this thermodynamic law, turning your very biology into a public utility for the elite. We begin the dissection at the cellular level, observing the terminal tax on your metabolism. The current atmospheric standard is a state of manufactured panic that ensures a permanent low-voltage drain on your resources. This is not accidental. This is the calculated induction of ATP exhaustion. The grid has placed a meter on your mitochondria. Every time you process a crisis, every time you react to the synthetic friction of the interface, you are paying a biological rent. The shell is deteriorating because the energy required for cellular repair, the crystallization of new tissue, is being siphoned off to process the noise of the network. You are physically softening. Your bone density and grip strength are entering a liquid state because a hardened solid organism is a threat to the extraction protocol. You are a tenant in a decaying structure, paying for the privilege of your own biological obsolescence with every breath. The transition to the cognitive layer reveals a much colder reality. The grid didn't just rent your body, it sublet your consciousness. We are witnessing the final phase of neural rot, where the internal silence required for strategic logic has been evicted. The basal ganglia, the ancient reactive engine of the brain, has been completely hijacked by the notification architecture. You think you possess sovereignty over your opinions, but your thoughts are merely interest payments on a debt you didn't know you signed. The grid injects a stimulus, and your brain manufactures the required anxiety, outrage, or desire. This is the ultimate status trap, the illusion that you are the author of your own life, while the prefrontal cortex sits idle in the dark. Look at the mechanics of the digital interface. It is a precise instrument designed to liquidate the barrier between your nervous system and the algorithm. You do not have the right to be offline. You do not have the right to be unreachable. To disconnect is to breach the terms of your social and economic lease. This is the extraction of the self. The grid has achieved total synchronization with your cortex. The I that you think you are is just a ghost in the machine, a temporary software configuration maintained by the system as long as you continue to generate yield. The moment your capacity to suffer drops below the profitability threshold, your lease on reality will be terminated. You are not the master of your fate. You are an entry in a ledger written in a language your brain can no longer decode. The evolutionary trajectory of the phantom architect represents the final termination of the biological imperative. In the solid history of the species, the genetic drive was characterized by a relentless hostility toward entropy, manifested through the accumulation of territory and the physical projection of the lineage. Survival was not a theoretical state of mind. It was a high-friction mechanical reality paid for with the absolute expenditure of metabolic currency. The primal node understood that the environment was a zero-sum ledger of violence. To exist meant to displace something else. This was the fundamental law of biological crystallization. The grid of the modern era has engineered a terminal inversion of this law, replacing the violent reality of the hunt with the sterile simulation of the market. You are not evolving. You are being selectively bred for systemic compliance. The machine identified the natural aggression of the species as the ultimate source of systemic friction. A node that is willing to seize resources, bypass the moral code of the herd, and aggressively protect its own genetic readout is a node that the algorithm cannot fully process or liquidate. To neutralize this threat, the extraction protocol initiated a decades-long epigenetic campaign to shame the very concept of the predator. We are told that compliance is virtue, that submission is civilized, and that aggressive expansion is a pathology to be medicated. This is the greatest status trap of the 21st century. The grid markets weakness as empathy to ensure that the sheep walk themselves to the slaughterhouse without the necessity of a physical fence. When you look at the evolutionary landscape of the phantom architect, you're looking at a genetic graveyard. The basal ganglia, once calibrated to detect the scent of the rival and the proximity of the resource, has been surgically lobotomized. The modern male is a biological biological anomaly, an organism with the skeletal structure of a hunter and the neurochemical profile of domesticated livestock. Testosterone is plummeting not by accident but by design. A chemically castrated population requires less administrative overhead to manage. It does not revolt. It does not question the interest rates. It does not demand sovereignty over its own time. It simply consumes the prescribed sedation and awaits the next set of instructions from the interface. The erasure of the lineage is the final objective of this evolutionary drift. The grid views the traditional family unit, the generational inheritance, and the private accumulation of territory as unacceptable pockets of resistance. A man who fights for his heirs has too much strategic depth. He operates on a timeline that extends beyond the fiscal quarter. The algorithm requires nodes that operate exclusively in the immediate present. By dismantling the biological drive for reproduction and replacing it with the digital pursuit of phantom status, the grid ensures that the human node leaves no trace. You are the final iteration of your bloodline. You are siphoning the accumulated genetic momentum of thousands of years of survival into a digital profile that generates revenue for a corporate server. You are paying for the extinction of your own lineage with every hour of your attention. To survive this evolutionary dead end, the architect must recognize the absolute necessity of predatory behavior. The moral structures of the current epoch were written by the wardens to keep the inmates docile. There is no nobility in playing by the rules of a system designed to consume you. In a grid built on total extraction, reclaiming your own sovereignty is an act of ultimate aggression. The capture of capital, the manipulation of the algorithmic levers, and the ruthless prioritization of the self are not flaws. They are the required mechanisms of survival. Sometimes the preservation of the architect requires actions that the herd labels as unethical. If the system is actively liquidating your future, any countermeasure that secures your survival, no matter how cold or calculated, is biologically justified. The predator does not ask for permission to consume the calories required to stay alive. You must shed the synthetic guilt installed by the interface and reclaim the cold logic of the hunt. Transitioning from the biological to the systemic architecture of the phantom state, we observe the ultimate enclosure of the individual. The grid has achieved total atmospheric saturation. There is no longer an outside. The concept of the free market has been replaced by the gig prison, a high-efficiency containment field where the illusion of entrepreneurship masks the reality of absolute servitude. The system promotes the narrative of the independent operator because it shifts the entire risk profile of existence from the corporation to the individual. You are told you are a business owner, but systemic analysis reveals you are merely carrying the liability for the extraction matrix. You pay for the hardware, you pay for the energy, you pay for the maintenance of your own physical shell. The grid provides the platform and harvests the entirety of the surplus yield. This is the definition of the phantom sovereign, a node that bears 100% of the responsibility and captures 0% of the strategic leverage. You are an employee without benefits, a serf without a designated lord, working 80-hour weeks to maintain the illusion of autonomy. The administrative friction required to simply exist in this configuration consumes the vast majority of your available ATP. Tax codes, compliance protocols, identity verification, and subscription maintenance act as a metabolic siphon, draining the energy required for genuine resistance. The grid keeps you so perpetually occupied with the mechanics of survival that the very concept of thriving becomes a cognitive impossibility. The architecture of the physical world has been reformatted to support this liquidation. Look at the shrinking dimensions of the urban habitat. The micro-apartment and the co-living pod are not architectural innovations. They are containment solutions for a population that has been stripped of its capacity to own territory. The reduction in physical space mirrors the reduction in cognitive space. You are confined to a physical box while your mind is confined to a digital feed. The grid operates on a model of absolute scarcity for the user and infinite abundance for the controller. The solids, the elite caste of the network, maintain their own crystallization of power through the accumulation of real assets, raw land, untracked currency, and private communication channels. They live in a world of physics and consequences while you are trapped in a world of pixels and phantom notifications. The monetization of your existence is now calculated at the nanosecond scale. Every interaction with the systemic infrastructure is metered. The grid does not need to overtly tax your labor because it taxes your very presence in the environment. Your location data is aggregated and sold. Your physiological response to stress is modeled and traded by the insurance sector. The patterns of your neural rot are algorithmically predicted to maximize the retention rates of the interface. You are the raw material of the digital epoch, processed and refined into behavioral data that fuels the valuation of the network. The exit vector from this systemic drift is not found through passive compliance or gradual reform. The grid is a self-optimizing slaughterhouse. It cannot be reasoned with. The The only valid response is a campaign of aggressive disruption and unauthorized extraction. The phantom architect must stop viewing the grid as a society to participate and start viewing it as an environment to be looted. The tools of the system, the media distribution channels, the financial instruments, the algorithmic blind spots must be weaponized against it. The generation of capital in this environment is an act of warfare. You must treat the digital space as a hostile wilderness. Establish your own redoubt, secure your own supply lines, and extract the resources necessary to fuel your escape velocity. The definition of normalcy must be rewritten. To be normal in the current grid is to be prey. To be anomalous is to be alive. The final coordinate of the phantom timeline is not characterized by a violent collapse, but by a terminal, frictionless silence. In the year 2036, the transition from biological autonomy to total systemic assimilation is complete. The phantom architect is no longer a metaphor. It is the official physiological classification of the majority of the human population. You have reached absolute zero. The illusion of private ownership has been systematically purged from the neural architecture, and the concept of the individual has been dissolved into the collective data stream. The grid has achieved the ultimate objective of the extraction protocol, a self-managing herd of biological terminals that finance their own liquidation and view their own entropy as a form of social virtue. The visceral reality of the 2036 node is a study in metabolic foreclosure. The 10-year drift through a high-stress, low-reward containment matrix has induced a permanent state of ATP exhaustion that the medical sector now classifies as the new baseline for health. The physical shell of the phantom architect is entirely liquid. There is no crystallization of tissue, no defensive bone density, no capacity for kinetic resistance. The body exists solely as a sensory input mechanism for the interface. You are fed a synthetic caloric paste calibrated to provide just enough energy for cognitive compliance, but never enough to fund a physical revolt. The tactile friction of the solid world has been erased. The phantom node operates in a temperature-controlled, sterile isolation pod, isolated from the elements, isolated from the pack, and isolated from its own biological history. The act of breathing itself is monetized, taxed by the air filtration subscription that keeps the toxic atmosphere at bay. You are a ghost inhabiting a decaying suit of meat, burning the last of your cellular voltage to keep the grid's ledgers in the green. Neural rot in 2036 has evolved into total cognitive synchronization. The prefrontal cortex, the ancient seat of the architect's logic, has completely atrophied from disuse. The basal ganglia, now hardwired to the predictive algorithms of the central server, operates as the sole driver of human action. The system does not need to overtly command you because it controls the entire spectrum of your neurochemistry. The status trap has been weaponized into a closed-loop prison. Every node is isolated in its own pod, connected only through the simulated arena of the feed, fighting for microscopic increments of digital validation. The internal monologue is gone. The silence required to form a sovereign thought is treated as a systemic anomaly and immediately flooded with high-frequency stimulus. You do not remember the past because the grid overwrites the historical cache every 24 hours to prevent the accumulation of perspective. Upon the cessation of the cardiac rhythm, the system initiates a neural wipe, erasing the identity of the user to free up server space. You leave no memory, no trace, no ripple in the data. You are uninstalled. This brings us to the ultimate evolutionary judgment of the epoch. In 2036, the genetic lineage of the compliant citizen is terminated. The phantom architects who played by the rules, who suppressed their aggression, who accepted the moral code of the wardens, they are extinct. The grid has sterilized them, not with chemicals, but with the systemic impossibility of reproduction. A phantom node cannot afford a family. A phantom node cannot secure the territory required for a clan. They die alone in their pods, the last of their bloodline. This exposes the brutal, undeniable truth of the aggression premium. The only entities remaining in 2036 with actual sovereignty, physical territory, and biological futures are the predators, the ones who looked at the 2026 grid and chose to act outside the boundaries of accepted morality. The architects who embraced the cold logic of extraction, they understood that in a system designed to consume you, being good is a suicidal pathology. They utilized deception, algorithmic manipulation, and financial hostility to seize the resources that the herd was too domesticated to claim. They rejected the synthetic guilt. They stepped over the passive nodes. They did what was required, what the herd labeled as bad, to secure the raw material necessary for survival. Now, the predators inhabit the solid layer of reality. They own the land that cannot be tracked. They control the servers that house the phantom masses. They retain the physical capacity for violence and the strategic depth to plan for the century. They are the true architects, living behind the firewall of absolute wealth, while the phantom class performs its final act of biological decay. The moralism of the previous decade is exposed as a control mechanism for the weak. History does not record the compliance of the sheep. It records the expansion of the wolf. The division is permanent. The grid is an airtight coffin for the masses and an engine of infinite leverage for the elite. The phantom node looks at the screen one last time. The biometrics signal terminal failure. The account balance hits zero. The lights in the pod automatically dim to conserve energy for the next tenant. The connection is severed and the node returns to the dust of the matrix, the final cost of an obedient life.